constant, with an iron will.
Immense moral courage.
Amazingly self-willed.
Energetic, almost beyond belief.
Self-righteous. Very feminine.
Tough as old boots. Железная lady.
And she was a very nice woman.
Margaret Thatcher, perhaps the most admired, perhaps the most controversial, certainly the most instantly recognisable British leader in the modern era, has died this week. In a special programme for BBC World News, The Rise and Fall of Margaret Thatcher, I've been reflecting on her unprecedented, indeed unpredicted rise to the top job in British politics, and also on her extraordinary downfall at the hands of colleagues in her own party a decade later. Margaret Thatcher, the woman who polarised a generation, whose legacy endures with a transformed political landscape. The whole idea of the Iron Lady owes as much to myth-making as to reality. Margaret Thatcher was as often a pragmatist as an ideologue, someone who manipulated images of womanhood. The warrior Boadicea, a stern matron, thrifty housewife, on occasion even coquettish. But her determination was beyond doubt, evident from childhood. Duty, thrift and hard work were values learnt in that Grantham grocer's shop. Margaret and her sister Muriel walked 4 miles back and forth to school each day. The Roberts sisters went to the Wesleyan Chapel in Grantham 3 or 4 times every Sunday. Alderman Alfred Roberts was a local politician who had an enormous influence on his ambitious daughter.
He was desperately anxious to give me every chance that he hadn't had, and I owe almost everything to this.
Oh, I think her beliefs were formed by her father. I think she was, in many respects, her father's son.
She thought he was wonderful. I have a feeling that she used to go and sit on town council meetings from time to time. So she sort of got into politics very early on. She spoke very little about her mother, who was a very good, kind, homely person. But probably Margaret considered her not, academic enough.
Margaret's main ambition was to escape from the town, which she rarely visited in later life. But at Somerville College, Oxford, the girl from Grantham was an outsider. She later described it as cold and strangely forbidding.
We found her sitting really rather sadly toasting a tea cake, and clearly she was lonely and probably homesick.
The dons at Somerville, who tended to be very much sort of Labour supporters, they were quite superior about her when I was there. They used to say to me, second-class mind and things of that kind. And they really missed perceiving that this was a very remarkable woman they had in their midst.
There was a warmer welcome at the University Conservative Association, and an ambition took hold.
My mother asked Margaret, "What are you going to do when you leave Oxford?" And she blurted out, "I'm going to be an MP." And she herself will tell you that that was the first time she voiced that thought, the very first time. She was very bossy at that party, you know. We had charades, and there she was, bossing us all. And a very mild school friend of mine lost her temper with her and said, "If you don't stop bossing us, I shall stamp on your foot."
Despite some optimistic canvassing, the young candidate failed to win the safe Labour seat of Dartford in the 1951 election. After a 6-year break from politics in which she gave birth to twins, Margaret Thatcher was selected for Finchley and joined the Commons in 1959.
I'm afraid I very rarely relax. We go away together once a year, and that's absolute heaven. But apart from that, I don't think I ever relax.
She was a junior pensions minister, reaching the cabinet as Education Secretary in 1970. Still an unusual role for a woman.
Well, you've all got something to work for then, really. You're working for qualifications, hoping that'll help you to get a better job.
She was certainly victimised. I mean, for example, she was always called Thatcher the milk snatcher after the removal of primary school milk from children. But the curious thing was, of course, that it was never her policy. It was the policy of the Chancellor, Anthony Barber, which then became associated quite unfairly with Margaret Thatcher for the rest of her political life.
We have been in power for about 4 months, and I feel this morning that our speakers have given me a programme for at least the next decade.
Her political style certainly didn't please everyone. When she was first suggested as Tory leader, Enoch Powell confidently predicted they would never put up with those hats and that accent. But when Edward Heath was challenged after the election defeat in October 1974, the outsider won.
It is like a dream, really. Wouldn't you think so? I almost wept when they told me. I did weep. Yes, I'm coming round again, and down, and up, and round about.
Sex was her secret weapon, not because she seduced the 1922 committee, but because nobody thought a woman could win. Nobody took the trouble to try to stop her. And suddenly there she was, and it was a huge shock.
You have just received a greeting which firmly and unmistakably underlines
Well, it was. Margaret led what I once described, and Julian Ridgely plagiarized, as a peasants' revolt. I mean, virtually nobody who was anybody in the party, in Parliament, voted for her. I mean, virtually none of the shadow cabinet voted for her. The grandees were always very dubious about Margaret Thatcher, but she was even more dubious about them.
After the winter of discontent, the Labour government was vulnerable. In the 1979 election, Margaret Thatcher campaigned successfully with an unprecedented pitch, the housewife who really knew about prices.
It is so much more convenient. And weight for weight is quite economical too, isn't it? If you think that you don't put in more than you need, because you know it is much easier.
Downing Street was hers. A controversial figure from the very outset, the new Prime Minister took an evangelical tone.
And I would just like to remember some words of St. Francis of Assisi, which I think are really just particularly apt at the moment. Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
The Blessed Margaret had arrived. From the 4th of May 1979, Britain would never be the same again.
Well, we're not in the least bit tired. We don't think we'll ever go home.
A decade later, things couldn't have looked more different. The party faithful couldn't have been more effusive when Margaret Thatcher celebrated 10 years as Prime Minister. But just 13 months later, the woman who'd won 3 elections for the Conservatives was deposed. Why did so many senior Tories turn against her?
I think and thought at the time that Margaret Thatcher stayed on too long. I supported her right to the end, and I thought she would prevail right at the end. But I wished in myself, and I think many other people did too, many of her friends did too, that she'd actually gone a little bit earlier, say a year or so earlier.
She tried to dominate people. She came to dominate the party. Immense price we paid for it. And she couldn't dominate me.
She was seen as increasingly out of touch. Even her grammar became monarchical.
We have become a grandmother of a grandson called Michael.
Towards the end of her time, her courage didn't desert her, but her political instincts did.
In what way?
She became reckless.
Tensions between a Prime Minister and Chancellor are now almost part of the British Constitution. But the arguments between Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson over Europe were the beginning of her downfall.
I only discovered how bitter the rows were with Nigel when he resigned. I hadn't realised it had come to that. They always had rows. They enjoyed combative exchanges, but they used to do it privately. There were no teams of people briefing the press. The press hadn't a clue how bad it was. Neither had other members of the cabinet. Suddenly it erupted, and he resigned.
Nigel Lawson and Geoffrey Howe had been pressing a reluctant Margaret Thatcher to join the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, which was the precursor of the single currency. She then appointed her own economic advisor in number 10, Alan Walters, who told her that Lawson had been making secret preparations to join the ERM. Mrs. Thatcher backed Walters against Lawson, and so he resigned.
Are you considering another rise in interest rates, Miss Lawson?
To lose a chancellor may be misfortune, but to lose a deputy prime minister as well looks like carelessness.
I only began to realise how bad things had become with Geoffrey when Margaret's behaviour began to deteriorate, so that she would treat him really very badly in cabinet and sometimes be slightly contemptuous in her treatment of him in front of colleagues, which was merely hastened the day when the break was going to come, because Geoffrey may have been discreet and loyal, but he was a big political figure. It was most unwise to treat him in that undiplomatic and contemptuous fashion.
Thank you, ma'am.
My relationship with Margaret Thatcher lasted 15 years, starting in 1975 and ending in 1990. And that's longer than most marriages last, and probably it was at its best at the beginning. My manner of argument is one of tenacious repetition, if you like. I don't like shouting at people, whereas I was shouted at to some extent. I think that can be quite irritating if you're a quiet, consistent badger. That doesn't always please the person who prefers badger baiting.
Demoted as Foreign Secretary, Howe was increasingly sidelined, not even told about the decision finally to join the ERM in October 1990.
I wasn't consulted about it, although I was Deputy Prime Minister. I heard about it from the Queen, rather embarrassingly. So I was kept at arm's length, and that was an uncomfortable position.
The badger was then baited beyond endurance by this rejection of proposals from Brussels.
The chairman or the president of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at a press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.
The Prime Minister was already expecting a Conservative leadership contest, and at her most regal indicated she was ready for a tough match.
I'm still at the crease, though the bowling's been pretty hostile of late. And in case anyone doubted it, can I assure you there will be no ducking the bouncers, no stonewalling, no playing for time.
But she wasn't prepared for this googly from her once loyal deputy.
It's rather like sending your opening batsman to the crease, only for them to find, the moment the first balls are bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
The resignation speech is one of the most dramatic events I've attended in the Commons. I was about 3 seats away from her. And she assumed that Geoffrey would follow his normal past practice and get up and give the standard resignation speech, instead of which Geoffrey gave one of the most devastating attacks on the style of government that any senior figure can ever have given to a government.
The Prime Minister's perceived attitude towards Europe is running increasingly serious risks for the future of our nation.
One minister said it was like a battered wife finally turning on a violent husband.
The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long.
She was shaken, but she couldn't believe that Geoffrey would make that speech. If you ever see the film of that, her face during that speech, she sat there expecting to hear the normal speech of a sort of minister who's resigned making a personal statement. And during the course of it, you can see she was deeply wounded. And it was the beginning of the end, quite frankly. And I happened to see Michael Heseltine that night, and he said to me, she's finished. After Geoffrey's speech today, she's finished. And there's no doubt at all that that convinced Michael that he should challenge her.
Someone else would have stood if I hadn't. But, well, I thought that we'd better dance the boil.
I am persuaded that I now have a better prospect than Mrs. Thatcher of leading the Conservatives to a fourth electoral victory